Hi, everyone. This is Maheen, and welcome to the Canadian SME Small Business Podcast. Today, we are looking at the backbone of digital communication because in 2026, as ad costs skyrocket, the most resilient businesses are shifting their focus away from rented traffic and towards owned infrastructure. Joining us is Nihal Mandanna, the Director of Growth at Cyberimpact. Nihal is an expert in product led growth and positioning for Canada's leading email marketing platform. He specializes in helping organizations build scalable systems that prioritize deliverability and data residency. He's here today to explain why email is core growth infrastructure, not just a marketing channel. So without further ado, let's dive in and welcome Nihal. Nihal, it's a pleasure having you on the show today. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
Great. Thank you for the fantastic intro. It's always a bit strange hearing people talk about you, so that's still
It
fun
is,
at the
but
same
it is
time.
a quite impressive bio, and
Yeah.
we're very excited to delve deeper into each of your expertise and your experience and kind of, break it down for our listeners.
Cool.
Let's open our discussion by understanding email as growth infrastructure, Nihal. Many organizations that treat email as a secondary campaign tool, but
Mhm.
you argue that it should be treated as a core growth infrastructure. Tell us, why does email still deliver high ROI and why is it underused?
Yeah, absolutely. You know, uh, there's a lot of thoughts around how do organizations grow, generally speaking, and most of the time, if you're given business advice, for example, it's go invest in your paid strategy, right? Go invest in your SEO, which are all core parts of your growth engine. But I think on the flip side, what people tend to forget is about the folks you already have or that audience you've already built, right? And my background, I've done a lot of work in like retention marketing and really got to see the value that a small but loyal cohort, let's call it, the folks that have opted in and agreed to hear from you, how much value they can drive for your business. So this can, of course, vary based on industry, but generally speaking, I think the ongoing number that people say is like every dollar you spend on email gives you like $42 in return, right? And I think very easy to make that connection if you are a type of business that runs on like revenue. Something in our case is like we work with a lot of orgs where their end goal isn't super clear, right? Maybe it's a government organization where they're not selling anything per se, but they can still measure the ROI on their communications with their audience. To me, I think a few reasons that email tends to perform so well, is ultimately it's like structural, and it's the fact that there's no real algorithm between you and your audience. So when, especially in Canada with all our compliance laws, when you end up talking to someone on your email list, this is someone that has shown really high intent to actually engage with your brand, with your business. So why wouldn't you try to capitalize on that? Something that I think, especially for a lot of small businesses, social, for example, has become this primary lever for growth where, okay, go start a social account, grow your followers. But the reality is that with these algorithms, your reach can be anywhere from like 2 to 6% on any given day. So you might have 10,000, 20,000 followers, but how many of them are actually seeing your content? Compare that to email, where even if you have a much smaller list, 1,000, 2,000 people, you can almost guarantee that at least 40, 50% of those people are getting the message that you're trying to put in front of them. In terms of like that underuse, I think there's a misunderstanding of like email, generally speaking, right? People look to it for as a growth channel. I argue it kind of gives you a strong base from which you can then experiment and be a bit more risky on other channels with, right? Not sure, for example, within the audience here at like the SME podcast, what that split might be exactly. But let's say you're an ecom, for example. If you own an e-commerce brand, generally speaking, email will be your primary driver of revenue. And most of that revenue ultimately comes from existing customers. And what you usually see is that existing customers will drive anywhere from 30 to 50% of a brand's revenue without them even thinking about it, right? So you go spend 10K, 20K on your Google meta ads, which is important, but you never really think about, okay, I spent $50 to get this customer. Maybe I got $30 out of them. So really to make my money back, I need to sell to them at least twice. Well, with email, you've already captured them. So now anything you do generate from them, for lack of a better word, is essentially free, right? Like you have the cost of like your platform and your effort to get in front of them, but you're not actually investing additional dollars per se to reach these people they've already reached before.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, that is quite insightful, Nihal, and it tells us that shifting the perspective from sending messages to building infrastructure, it really allows a business to create a much more predictable revenue stream.
correct.
Now let's explore how own channels create predictable and scalable growth. Please tell us, how can businesses scale using own channels like email instead of paid ads?
Yeah, I think just building off what I was saying earlier in terms of paid ads, generally speaking, the cost of acquisition across verticals, across industries has gone up 3 to 4x in the past like 5 years. So what this means for you as a small business, for example, is to actually get a customer through the door costs you a lot of money, a lot more than it did before. So now that you've actually got this customer to come through, email kind of gives you the power to grow your list while keeping your costs flat. And what that means for you is that your revenue per send actually compounds, right? Because you're not paying to get that people back through the door again. So generally, I think when people think about email, I think the false equivalency is they'll view it as an acquisition tool. Oh, it's not bringing me new customers, therefore I shouldn't invest in it. But I think if you actually shift your thinking to really view it primarily as a retention and call it sustainable growth engine, it kind of gives you that leverage you need, right? Because acquisition is hard and expensive. But if you can actually build and maintain a relationship with someone that's already in your list, you're going to see that return come back to you multiple times over. And I guess practically speaking, for orgs that do treat email as a channel for sustainable growth, they tend to invest in their list building as seriously as they might in their paid ad campaigns, right? So yes, it's important to have very strong paid ads, but once someone lands on your site, for example, what are you doing to actually keep them in touch with you, right? So in your website, your checkout flows, your social profiles, everywhere you get the opportunity, you really should be trying to convert visitors into audience members or subscribers, right? Not just a fleeting visitor that you'll never see again.
Right.
And I think just specifically for Canadian SMEs, I think the ad market, for better or for worse, is dominated by a lot of large players, often with budgets you can't really compete with. But
Mhm.
if you build a strong relationship with a small cohort of really loyal customers, that's a moat they can't really break, right? Like now you're actually building relationships, not just doing this in like a transactional fashion.
Right. Investing in the audience you already own is quite the fastest way to increase, our margins without really increasing our ad budget. So thank you for highlighting that,
Of
Nihal.
course.
Next up, let's discuss how data ownership strengthens resilience and long-term strategy. Please tell us, why is Canadian data residency becoming a strategic priority?
I mean, I think we all know why. But yeah, I think there's a few different reasons, but there's definitely geopolitical and regulatory reasons for the shift. In Canada specifically, we've had data privacy and commercial electronic spam laws that are more in line with, let's say, the EU and Europe than our neighbors down south. And this is becoming more and more of a big deal, I think, with how things are going. So, the US, their data practices generally follow like an opt-out model. So anyone can get your data, anyone can send you a message, and it's up to you to remove yourself from that list. While in Canada, we do have frameworks in place where if you're a business, you need to have explicit or implicit consent to actually add someone to your list. Um, what this means for you as like a org, and I think strategically is, as even at a federal or provincial level, we're getting a lot of stuff around buying Canadian or investing in building a Canadian data stack for your business, which I think is an important thing even as a nation for us to start thinking about, right? Is like we rely on foreign infrastructure quite a bit, and we will continue to do so, at least until we get to that point. But you can start now by kind of investing in like all these pieces that actually protect customer and client data, but also I think position yourself as like an investor in the, call it, Canadian data and Canadian tech ecosystem.
Mhm.
For SMEs, I think they often think that compliance won't really come back to bite them. And the reality is, yeah, if you're like a very small business, no one's really going to come knocking on your door to be like, hey, you're not following CASA guidelines. But if you think about it from the end user, your customer or the audience that you're trying to build, I think it does build a certain level of trust if they know that you're following really good data practices, you're following consent laws, and you essentially respect the data that they're willingly handing over to you. And Cyberimpact, we are Quebec based. We operate under Canadian law, and we store all our data here on Canadian soil. And it's something we've always believed in, I think, as we think about how do we become a part of this data sovereignty and like owned tech landscape within Canada. And I think for a lot of smaller businesses too, it's like, how do I start thinking about what does compliance and privacy mean to me from a brand perspective, not just a business perspective or a revenue perspective, where I think as Canadian audiences care a lot more about these things, that can almost become a little badge for you, right? Like, I respect your privacy, I respect your consent. And I think that becomes this hidden moat, right? Where someone sees that, and I think they will be like, yes, I want to work with businesses that also respect my data.
Right.
Yeah.
By prioritizing Canadian-based infrastructure, it tells us that it protects our long-term business resilience and really builds a higher level of trust with our local audience. And to all the small business owners watching us, I mean, in 2026, our data is our most valuable asset. And
Yeah,
if your customer information is sitting on, foreign servers, you are vulnerable to shifting global regulations and the privacy laws. So please don't just pick a tool just because it's popular.
exactly.
Pick a tool that keeps your data at home and your deliverability high. Um, now
And
let's,
if I may, Maheen, like
yeah, go ahead.
just to that point around what it means for like businesses in Canada, for example, right? Oftentimes with foreign tech tools, and this isn't just within our space, they're usually built for a different set of regulations and a different market altogether. Uh,
Right.
Maybe a different, not exactly the same, but for example, most of the time when you buy US software, you are paying in USD, even when your pricing on the surface isn't Canadian, right? So
Mhm.
not only are you, I guess, inadvertently devaluing our local currency by not paying in our local currency, you also end up paying Forex fees on top of that, right? When you actually work with some of these vendors. Some are better than others, but I think when you think about this from a long-term investment perspective, can we as like citizens and small business owners, folks trying to build stuff in Canada, what can we do to like make sure that we have our own infrastructure that lets us scale globally rather than relying on others to build that for us, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Oh, you're absolutely right. I mean, treating our email as infrastructure, it means owning the pipes and the data. And this is how, you build a business that lasts. So thank you for highlighting that, Nihal.
Of
And
course.
now let's look at how improving deliverability drives better marketing performance.
Yeah.
Tell us this connection, the role of deliverability, Nihal. Like, how does deliverability impact performance, and what mistakes should be avoided?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a lot of folks don't really think about deliverability because it is this technical layer, right, that you never really need to think about. But the reality is that, let's say you are using email as a channel. If your emails aren't landing in the inbox, you're not getting the value that you want out of it. The people that want to hear from you aren't getting the message. And I also think you end up seeing your metrics skewed a bit, right? So you might see your email send rates, for example. Oh, I sent 10,000 emails. Why is my open rate only at like 20%, right? You don't really get feedback most of the time on like, is my email landing in the inbox? Is it landing in spam? What's happening, right? And I think most of the time, what people don't think about at the base is like a lot of email deliverability issues ultimately stem back to like list quality, right? So that's one of the factors where, of course, there's the technical setup where you do want to make sure that your SPF, DKIM, DMARC, which are like the technical layers, that's all set up. So this is you authenticating your domain. But then I think from an end user perspective, it's how clean are you keeping your list, right? So I think especially in Canada, what this means is like, don't buy lists because it's not CASL compliant. Don't email people that, for example, haven't engaged with your emails in, I don't know, over 6 months, right? Like something we recommend a lot of our clients to do is every 6 months, just do a quick audit of your list. Anyone that hasn't clicked, engaged, or like shown any interest in your emails, put them in a, sunsetting phase out campaign. And I think a lot of folks are always afraid of, you know, the big U word, unsubscribes, right? Like everyone doesn't want to lose the subscribers they have. I think the reality is that you actually don't want to worry too much about that because if someone doesn't want to listen to you or hear from you anymore, it's fine, right? Like you can always get them back in the future if things changed. But what it does for you in the short term is now you're actually sending to a highly engaged list that's properly cleaned. And what this does at a technical perspective too is it actually gives you better engagement signals. So Yahoo, Google, all these folks don't flag you for, say, bad sending practices. I also think moving forward, AI monitoring and the use of AI in inboxes is going to continue to get even more prevalent. I think we see it already a little bit where you'll see AI summaries or, Gmail, for example, will try to unsubscribe you or give you the option to unsubscribe from every email that you've never opened in, say, the past 3 to 6 months. So
Right.
as a business, these are all things you should be taking into consideration. If someone has to be reminded by a third party that, hey, you don't really care about this business anymore, I think
Mhm.
that's kind of a bad look for one. And for yourself, I think it maybe also ends up with focusing on the wrong groups of people rather than that smaller engaged list that really wants to hear from you and where you're going to see value. And I think for most people, just paying attention to like how are your emails being received, right? Most of the time, your audience will actually give you feedback. And if they're telling you, for example, oh, I don't think this content's relevant to me, I think that's something you should like think about, right? How do I actually make it relevant to them so they don't feel compelled to like,
Absolutely. Even the best email strategy is useless if your infrastructure, isn't really optimized to bypass that spam filters and
yeah.
reach the inbox. Finally, Nihal, let's explore how automation helps scale relationships without the added complexity. Tell us, when should businesses start automation and what should they automate first?
Yeah, I love this question, and it's something that we've been discussing internally as well. Where I think a lot of folks kind of have this idea that automation is something I'll do when I'm bigger or when I have more resources, because it's viewed as this really complex thing that is tough to get off the ground. The reality is, for most orgs, like automation is actually what helps you scale without adding headcount or adding work to your plate. So most of the time, what I recommend is, start with your highest leverage, low complexity flows. So most of the time, this would be your welcome sequence. I think everyone should have a welcome sequence for sure, no matter what you're selling. Even if you do consulting, for example, you should have a welcome sequence if someone submits a quote, kind of explaining your story, telling them a bit more about you, and building that trust right from the get-go. I think depending on the type of business, once again, let's say you do sell products, having your abandoned cart sequences super important, as well as like re-engagement. Uh, Post-purchase or post-conversion, I think, is another area a lot of people kind of just forget about. But since someone has shown really high intent, now's kind of the perfect time to keep building on that, right? So they purchase something from you, make sure they get that confirmation, and make sure that you're actually using that real estate, right, when you have their attention to potentially convince them they made the right decision or to make another decision that you want as well. And then I think the overall thing I'd say to folks is like, try not to overcomplicate things before you have more data. So what we usually recommend is start simple, pick one trigger. So that could be a criteria for your business. Do one sequence and do like 3 to 4 emails. So very small. You can probably get all these set up in, like 2 to 3 days.
Mhm.
And then just keep watching your performance, optimize from like what you're actually seeing on the metric side, and then improve it on an ongoing basis, right? And I think that experimentation is really what's going to give you the most value out of automation rather than just letting it run indefinitely without ever looking at what you did.
Right. No, that is a great starting point. I mean, starting with simple, high impact automations, it allows a team to scale their communication without losing the personal touch. This was great context and great information that you were able to give to our listeners, Nihal, in such a short amount of time. As you wrap up now, what advice would you give businesses that haven't used their email list in months?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think the first thing we've seen, even in like the conferences we go to, is folks will be like, "Oh, I haven't reached out to people. Now I'm going to send everyone an email." And I think honestly, the worst thing you can probably do after a long silence is send a mass email to your list as if there wasn't this giant gap in between, and you're very likely to get a big spike in like complaints or unsubscribes. What I would probably recommend is re-engaging in segments. So find your most recent and most engaged contacts. Basically, do like a new low pressure reintroduction, kind of explain what value they can get from staying subscribed. But I also think letting people unsubscribe gracefully is a core part of this step too, where if there are people on your list that just don't remember you anymore or don't care about what you're doing anymore, this is the perfect time to give them that option to be like, oh, if this really isn't relevant to you anymore, feel free to unsubscribe so you won't hear from us. And it can be a scary proposition, but I think what it then lets you do is you have a smaller list. You know for a fact that these people want to stay around, and you'll even just at a personal level, you'll feel better when you actually see people engaging and opening your content rather than just sending it into the void, right? And just seeing that spike in unsubscribes bring you down.
Right.
Yeah.
That is a great reminder, Nihal, that the best time to start strengthening your existing systems is right now.
Exactly.
Thank you so much again for sharing such great expertise and your insights, and thank you for being so detailed and thorough.
Of course. Thank you, Maheen.
And listeners, that was Nihal Mandana from Cyberimpact, a masterclass on how to treat email as core growth infrastructure and why Canadian data residency is the key to long-term success. Again, thank you so much for tuning into the podcast. Please be sure to subscribe and visit CanadianSME.ca for more resources. A special shout out before we leave to our partners, UPS and ADP, for their ongoing commitment to empowering small businesses across Canada. Please keep thriving, and we'll see you in the next one.